Welcome everybody to today's webinar on the IEA PVPS Task 16. Please hold the line while we wait for more attendees to join. Welcome everybody to today's webinar of the IEA PVPS Task 16 hosted by ISES. Please hold the line and we will begin in about a minute. All right, thank you everybody for joining us on the webinar today. I think we are good to go now. And first off, I'm gonna introduce you to ISES and the work we do. So once again, welcome everybody. My name is Arabella and I am the Congress's Communications and Outreach Officer here at the ISES HQ in Freiburg. And I will give you a short introduction into ISES and the work we do, as we have many new participants joining us on the webinar today. So ISES, who are we? ISES, the International Solar Energy Society, is a non-profit UN-accredited membership NGO, and we've been founded in 1954. ISES represents a diverse membership of academics, researchers, energy practitioners, consultants, students, business, and advocates from countries all around the world. Our vision is 100% renewable energy for all, used efficiently and wisely. And ISES works together with like-minded organizations from countries, again, all around the world, to advance the renewable energy transformation. To do this, ISES has a wide variety of key activities we pursue throughout the year. One of them is our biannual congresses, which take again place either in Europe or in countries all around the world. We've got the upcoming ISES Solar World Congress 2023, and again this year, and I'm going to talk about that a bit later on, we have Eurosun 2022 that's just coming up next month in September. We have two major publications. One is the Solar Energy Journal, which many of you will know, and then we have a new edition that's Solar Energy Advances, and we started that in 2021, and that's a fully open access journal by ISES and Elsevier. We hold webinars, such as the one you're attending today, and we have several education initiatives, usually taking place during our conferences or also online. And in the regards to knowledge sharing, next to those webinars, we also do infographics on several themes, and we have recently started and are continuing to work on a solar energy museum. That's an online museum going through the history of solar. So if you're not a member of ISES yet, we would definitely ask you to join and support the work that we do. And if you are a member, we very much want to say thank you for your support. Now, on the topic of the webinar today, you, the audience, have the opportunity to ask questions to our presenting speakers, and we're going to have a cumulative Q&A session at the very end of the webinar. And for that, once we get started with the presentations, you can send in your questions using the chat box. When you send in those questions at any time throughout the webinar, please keep them short and precise, and please also indicate who the question is for, so that our moderator has an easy job in assigning them to the speakers. And on that note, it's my great pleasure to introduce you to today's moderator, Dave Renee. Dave has served as the president of the ISES for almost 10 years, from 2010 to 2019, and now he holds the position of ISES immediate past president on the ISES executive committee. From 1991 until his retirement in 2012, Dave managed the solar resource assessment activities at NREL in the US, and then in 2012 he formed the consultancy Dave Renee Renewables. Dave is closely associated with Task 16. He's going to moderate the webinar, and he's also going to give us a first introduction into the task. So Dave, thank you very much for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Arabella, for your introduction, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody on this webinar. We have a very good attendance for this webinar today. I'm very pleased to see that. Before we get into the individual speakers, I wanted to give a quick overview of Task 16 and the topic of firm PV power, which you'll learn more about during the presentations to come. But this is one of the tasks under or one of the subtasks, I should say, under task 16. If you could move to the next slide, I can explain more what task 16 is. It's under the International Energy Agency's Photovoltaic Power Systems Program. The IEA, of course, was founded back in 1974 during the oil embargo. In the 1990s, the IEA got very heavily involved in renewable energy and organized a number of what they call technology collaboration programs, which are technology-specific activities where experts from around the world can join to share research or conduct joint research and to advance the causes of renewable energy. PVPS is one of those technology cooperation programs that was established in 1993. And the role of PVPS is to facilitate the photovoltaic solar energy as a cornerstone in the energy transformation. The next slide. Currently, we have over 100 representatives from universities, research organizations, meteorological services, and even commercial solar service providers from 19 different countries. You can see here on this map that many of our members are from the European region, but we also have the US and Canadian representatives and representatives from Asia and Australia. And we have in the past had also representation from South America. And the next slide, what I would like to do is just quickly explain the value and reason for having this task. Solar resources, as we all know, are the fundamental fuel for powering photovoltaic systems and for providing concentrating solar power and solar thermal energy resources to support a variety of end-use energy requirements. There are other programs representing CSP and solar thermal within the IEA, so we're going to focus here on the photovoltaic technologies. And it's very important because PV has become one of the most dominant new energy sources around the world. We're experiencing very large PV systems going into the grid, as well as high penetration for the grid to the grid, and this requires the need for high quality and very clear meteorological information to help support the inclusion of this variable renewable technology into the grid. The values that the PVPS research provide is independent benchmarks of various models and forecasting techniques, state-of-the-art descriptions of work that's being done around the world, with the intention especially to lower the uncertainties, which of course leads to lowering of implementation costs for PV, and in turn results in more PV installations around the world. And one of our main outcomes of this task is a solar resource handbook that is upgraded regularly. This solar resource handbook is, you can see the link for it down below. It can be found on both the PVPS as well as the National Renewable Energy Laboratory websites. So on my final slide, just to give you a highlight of how the task is organized, we have 4 subtasks. One of them is called Measurements and Models, managed by NREL and DLR. The second subtask is Enhanced Data and Bankable Products, which is managed by Minas Paris Tech. The third subtask, the one that's our work today is going to be focusing from, is Solar Forecasting Techniques, managed at Fraunhofer ISE in Freiburg, Germany. And then the fourth task is a general dissemination and outreach task, such as what we're doing today at this webinar. We have workshops, online seminars and webinars and forums. And of course, the main product coming out of this task is the Solar Resource Handbook, which has been updated several times now. Jan Riemann is not only the head of subtask 4, but he's also the overall operating agent for task 16. But I'm introducing the task, since Jan will be one of our presenters today. talking about firm PV power. So with that, I'd like to go directly into introducing our first speaker, Dr. Richard Perez from the State University of New York at Albany in the United States at the Atmospheric Sciences Research Center. He's on the advisory board also at George Washington University Solar Institute. Richard has served many terms as on the board of directors of the American Solar Energy Society. For years, he was an associate editor of the Solar Energy Journal, and he's produced over 250 journal articles, book chapters, and conference papers, and holds US patents on energy storage and load management using photovoltaics. Richard, we're very honored to have you here, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Dave. And good morning or afternoon, everyone, wherever you're calling from. I hope you can see my screen. So we're talking about firm power generation for 100% renewable power grids. So three things I'm going to focus mainly on solar, but what I say is probably applicable to wind as well. About solar, three things to remember. It's a very big resource. Is getting to be very inexpensive. And most important, it is 365. By 365, I mean that it's available, it can be available all the time. And that's what firm power is about. You have to be able to generate power whenever it's needed. So we know it's big. It's much bigger than the finite resource and all the other resources combined. And there is much more than enough to serve the demand of the planet here in blue under all forms of energy, orders of magnitude more than needed. It's also getting to be quite inexpensive via photovoltaic power generation, and because the cost of PV has been going down by orders of magnitude over the last decades, and it's now, according to many, Bloomberg, Lazard Bank, NREL, you can compare all the generating resources and compare their unsubsidized cost for energy generation. And if you look at utility scale PV now, it's very, very low, especially compared, if I draw a line, vertical line to that cost, it's much cheaper than conventional generation. In particular, here I highlight peaking gas, coal, and nuclear. It's about 5 to 10 times cheaper than nuclear on a pure kilowatt hour basis. It's about on par with those same plants, fully depreciated, just the operating cost of operating those plants. And we're not done yet. Many predict solidly that PV will be even cheaper 10 years from now, while the conventional ones are likely to go up for both environmental and strategic external reasons, which are not fully accounted for. And we see a big strategic externality taking place today, mostly in Europe, but all around the world, with the Ukraine crisis pushing the gas price much higher than I have them on these graphs here. But what about 365? Because that comparison is not 100% fair. The conventional generation is dispatchable, whereas PV is run of the weather. It's not dispatchable. So let's delve into that. This is PV generation on any given day. It is intermittent, whereas conventional generation is firm, dispatchable, and can meet the load with certainty. And as a result of that intermittency, PV has grown, and wind as well, as a marginal resource. So operating at the margin, this is the load. That's the load of any utility in the world. That happens to be New York City in winter. But when I put PV on top of that generating load here, it operates at the margin, and the core of the generation is base load and dispatchable conventional generation. And when you grow PV on a power grid, you make the job of the underlying dispatchable generation harder. You have steeper ramps taking place. You need much higher quality forecasts to make sure that everything operates. And at the end of the day, you can only grow so much, and the underlying generation job will be harder and harder and will cost more. So you've all heard about the duck curves growing on power grids, but that's only the tip of the iceberg. There is a much bigger problem, which is multi-day and seasonal. So this is the load PV production, daily PV production that happens to be in New York, and that's the electrical demand of New York. And you can see there is a big mismatch, especially if I look in the winter time. Yeah, you have almost a month without resource while the load is picking up. So how do you fix that big discrepancy? How do you make the PV resource 24/365? How do you transform marginal resource into a grid dominant resource? Well, you have to basically transform the PV shape in yellow here into load shape, because that's what you need to do. This is the load of New York City. That's a resource on a few days in New York City, and you have to transform one into the other. And the way you do that, everybody is banking on storage to do the job. You can also use geographic dispersion to do that, or make the load more flexible, or blend wind and solar. But the big one is energy storage. And physically, it can do the job. When you have excess, you put it into storage. And when you don't have enough, you take it back from storage. And storage technologies are evolving quite rapidly, and there are many technologies available to do storage. I like to divide them in three categories: the big macro mechanical storage technologies like pumped hydro and compressed air storage. You have the battery storage technologies, electrochemical, and then you have the fast response technologies like flywheels, supercapacitors. And among the batteries, you notice that lithium ion, which is powering all your laptops and all your phones, and now the cars, it's growing rapidly and getting cheaper, like many batteries. However, doing that job of transforming intermittent to firm PV only relying on storage is very, very expensive. Whereas the cost of intermittent PV is very cheap, as we've seen from the Lazard graph, making it available 24/365 with storage only is a very expensive proposition. It's almost a factor 20-1. And here I use a storage projection in the future, which is at the bottom range of 20 years from now. It's a very optimistic projection. Even then, that job may be considerably difficult. But there is a solution to that, which has been ignored because it's a bit counterintuitive. You build more solar than you need, and you waste some of it. You curtail it when you don't need it. But when you do that, here on the x-axis, I have the amount of curtailment, the amount of solar I'm willing to waste. You can see a very interesting trend. The white line is the cost LCOE of firm power. The red line is the contribution of PV, which goes up because I'm wasting some of it. I don't monetize all of my PV, but the impact of storage is dramatic. You need much, much less storage. In fact, that overbuild and curtail is so effective that we started calling it implicit storage, because it does the job of storage. It acts as a catalyst to storage to make the proposition of supplying 24/365 much cheaper. You still need storage to go through nights and all contingency, but you need much, much less of it. And the cost, the bottom line, is much cheaper. And the business press is catching up on it. That's a quote from last year from Quartz magazine. Solar energy is so cheap that it can be wasted. They didn't quite get what I wanted to say. It must be wasted to get really cheap. The only issue with that, and has to evolve, is that today it's not monetizable. No developer I know in solar will overbuild and curtail solar because the regulations are such that that's very effective solution for the future cannot be enabled because you're not paid to supply firm power, you pay to supply unconstrained energy. So this has to change over time. So, but it's highly effective, as we'll see in two examples, one in Switzerland, very diverse example, and another one in MISO, the Mid-Continent System Operator, a big interconnected region in the central US. And I'm looking forward also to look at what's going on in the Western US, where we'll see the impact of that cost of storage on that firm generation proposition. So on this, I will hand the microphone back to Dave. Looking forward to hear from Switzerland and Jan Raymond.
Thanks very much, Richard, for that very clear and compelling description of what we mean by firm PV power and how we can achieve it through a concept of overbuilding and curtailment. Our next speaker is Jan Raymond. Jan is, as I mentioned earlier, the operating agent for this task, IEA PVPS Task 16. He's been the operating agent since 2017. Jan has a solid background in geography and climatology and has been working for more than 20 years at the Mediotest organization in Bern, Switzerland. He is the project lead of the well-known global solar radiation database MeteoNorm. So Jan, I will turn the floor over to you. Welcome.
Yes, thank you, Dave, for the nice introduction. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are. 1 second. Can you see my screen, or do you see the right one?
We see both the main screen and the next slide.
Okay, and this one is now good, I think.
Yes, that's good.
Okay, yeah. So I will show today the firm PV power study which we did in Switzerland. I didn't do it alone. The biggest work was done by Mark Paris, who modeled it, and by Richard Paris, who put in a lot of knowledge and experience they did with their studies they did, like the MISO study, which we will talk about later. So our first thanks go to both of them. Okay, I will talk shortly about the conditions in Switzerland, what kind of input data we used, the scenarios, the cost levels, assumptions, then going to the results, to the cost levels, to the installed capacities, and make my conclusions. So up to now, PV is quite small. We looked at the 3 years of 2018 to 2020. This was our basis. At this time, it was 3% on average. Last year, it was already 5%. We had almost 4 gigawatt peaks installed, but we have a growth of about 30% of a year, so it's quite growing strongly. The consumption itself in Switzerland, it's about 60 terawatt hours, and it's stable since about 10 years. It's mostly hydropower and nuclear power stations currently, with a small share of PV with the 3%. Historically, we are strongly connected to Europe, so the European grid, it was started in Switzerland in 1958. We have imports during wintertime and exports during summertime, and net annually we are quite, there is a small import or small export. However, it will change in future. We are not coupled to the EU market system anymore, because there is a missing framework and electricity agreement. And so we are in the center, but left out somehow. And that's why we also added some scenarios with autonomous grid and restricted import. What we didn't do here, we did no grid modeling, we did no climate change taken into account. So this is just to tell at the beginning, this haven't been looked at. Here you see to the right also how it is from day to day. You see the imports during the winter and the export during the summer. And it's mostly hydropower and nuclear. We have 3 types of hydro to be separate in Switzerland. First, it's runoff river at the rivers. Then we have the large lakes like the Contixons, which is shown at the right. This is seasonal storage, mostly from summer to winter. And then we have pumped storage for short-term storage within days. One of the work for MeteoTest was to model the inflow to the seasonal storage. It's mostly in the spring because they are at the higher altitudes, about 2,000 meters above sea level. So during winter time, there is hardly no inflow, and most of the inflow comes from March to June during the snow melt season. The basis of our work was the years 2018 till 2020 and the hourly time series of the ENSOE hourly time series. ENSOE is the European Association for the Cooperation of the Transmission System Operators. They have a transparency platform where we took the data from. But they have quite a lot of gaps, and that's why we have to correct them. First to the official dates of the Swiss Federal Office of Energy. Then we have had to fill gaps. Hourly gaps have been filled linearly, and long gaps have been filled with PV data, model PV data, based on global tilted irradiance data from Switzerland. All have been used. The time series of these 3 years to scale up to 2050. It's important if you look at, for example, the production 2 years ago. In Switzerland, the production doesn't fit the load currently because it is still linked to European market, and it's mostly produced for the peak hours because we have quite a lot of hydropower for the neighboring countries. This has been taken into account by the modeling of Mark Perez. Our scenarios was based on the energy perspectives 2050 plus. This is a net zero CO2 scenario, and we just modeled the state of 2050. There will be quite a strong growth of energy consumption. It goes up to 85 terawatt hours, and the nuclear will be phased out. 2050, there would be about 66 to 83 years old, and it is assumed that there will be no nuclear power stations anymore. So in short, the nuclear power will be exchanged with PV. We have 6 sub-scenarios. I will show the next slide, and additionally 4 options. So we have modeled Switzerland as an island. We call this standalone or autonomous in the upcoming slides, or we have it linked to the electricity market as it has been historically. We are using Swiss and US cost levels. One is conservative, one is optimistic. Finally, 6 multiplied with 4 gives the 24 scenarios we calculated. Here you see the 6 main scenarios. The first one was this energy perspectives with on annual basis, there is no import. But then for scenario 2, we added 10% net annual import. For scenario 3, we have the same, but we restricted the import regarding the power. So we limited to 3 gigawatt. Normally it's up to 10 gigawatts possible. We have in the 4th option, we added e-fuels. In the 5th option, we added import and e-fuels. And in the 6th scenario, we added also e-fuels and also some agri-PV. To the right, to see the same, you see the black parts. These are the imports, which are quite significant in scenario 2, 5, and 6. And in 4, 5, and 6, there is also some significant e-fuels part. The cost levels were based on this very well study from NREL, the ATB study database. We have 2 options, one based optimistic on US data for large-scale applications and one quite conservative for small scale. In Switzerland, there will be a lot of small-scale PV and also storage, which of course makes it more expensive. But until 2040 or 50, also some bigger scale applications are possible. That's why we just have the 2 of them as a bracket from where it can range to, and also looking at the sensitivity of these 2 assumptions. Here are the biggest and the most important figures here. These are the installation costs of PV. You see the 860 we assumed of Swiss francs per kilowatt. Swiss francs is the same as euro and US dollar at the moment. And you saw also 390, so about half of it for the US assumptions. Storage is a huge difference between small scale storage and large scale storage. For battery, we have almost a factor of 8 between the two assumptions. We had to assume also, of course, gas prices. They are quite low here. At the moment, they are very high, as you know, but we didn't change that too much. This is the method as Richard just shown, so I can flip this. Here is this batch model. So we looked at the load. We took away the wind, the hydro river dispatch as normal, and then we had some kind of a fixed export. And then this has to be, we looked at the residual load. If there is more PV than residual, we fill the pumped storage, and then the electrochemical storage, so the batteries within the capacity limits, and then finally we curtail. If there is a deficit, we first discharge pumped storage, then the batteries, and if this is not enough, then we discharge the resources like hydro storage, the long-term storage, the natural gas, and also the e-fuels. Here we come to the results. Here you see the new PV capacities. They are in the range between 50 and 60 gigawatts. You see also a green line, which is called max acceptable. It is assumed that about 50 gigawatt can be quite easily installed in Switzerland above this level. It would be possible, of course, but it would be a bit more critical to some part. You see only one scenario, the standalone scenario with almost no import or with no import. This would be above this limit. So on the right side, you see the standalone. On the left side, you see the linked scenarios. In the blue lines are the US costs, and the red bars are the Swiss costs. You see regarding the capacities, the differences are not too big. Of course, regarding the battery and the curtailment, the differences are quite big and depend largely on the costs of the storage. In Switzerland, with the Swiss cost assumptions, a curtailment of about 10–15%. If we have standalone, it would be about 20–25% optimally. The costs are all between largely 5.5 and 8 cents per kilowatt hours. That's also the range we had historically in Switzerland. At the moment, they are much higher on the market. So all of them are quite feasible from the viewpoint of the costs, especially compared to the current situation. And some of them with annual technology costs would be even lower than today's. Here are two scenarios. To the left, you see scenario 6 with agri-PV and some import. As an example of result, you see it will be about 30% of PV, only quite a small part with batteries because they will be quite expensive in this assumption we use there. We have pumped hydro, we have e-fuels, we have hydro storage and hydro river, and a small part of wind. If we have some more wind, it would help because it's blowing mostly in winter time in Switzerland, but it is assumed quite conservative. Also in this case, we didn't take it too much into account. On the right side, you see the installed capacities between 40 and 50 mainly. In the integrated options to the right, you see the scenario 4A. This is the standalone. You see it would go up to 48 gigawatts for PV installed. And we see the curtailments needed in energy and the least cost prices or costs of the energy, of the total energy. Capacities would be about 10 to 25 gigawatt hours, which is quite low. And the imports you see to the right, There are imports with the scenarios 1 to 6, and then with the standalone imports, you have 0 import. Looking at the seasonal patterns, at the top you see with import export, a similar pattern as today, but of course a lot of PV now in summertime. In wintertime you still need some import. On the bottom you see the scenario, the same scenario, but without connection to Europe. We can model it. It's still possible, and also the prices are almost the same as you have seen before. But this is only possible due to this curtailment and overbuilding, as has been shown before by Richard. These are the hourly production patterns. During the summer days, we would have PV at day, of course, a lot curtailed, then batteries in the evening, hydro in the second part of the night, and some export during the day. The level is -2000 here, so the import would be negative import, it would be export. During the winter time, it is mostly hydro-based. If we have a sunny day, it would be enough still in winter time, with only very small parts of curtailment, even no. And then we have additional some e-fuels in this scenario 5 here, and imports which go up to 2 to 3 gigawatts here. This is a week in January, and it is scenario 5 with about 12% of energy curtailment of PV. Here we are coming to this famous optimal curves. At the top you see the versions, the scenarios 1 to 6 with links to Europe. At the bottom, the standalone. As I said, all scenarios showed about 6 to 8 cents. The lowest cost for Switzerland would be scenario 2 with about 40 gigawatt of PV. As I said, it's about 4 gigawatt at the moment, so much more, 10 times more. About 50% of the energy, 15 is curtailed, 15 gigawatt of batteries, 10% of net imports, 10% of a rise of the seasonal storage. It's about 10 terawatt hours. It would go up to 11. There are some projects out which can make this possible. It's even additional 2 terawatt hours are in discussion, and then a small rise of the pumped storage from about 3 to 6 gigawatts. Additionally, we would need to import about 5 terawatt hours of e-fuels in this scenario. You see at the bottom line, the standalone version, only one is quite different, the scenario 1A. If you really have no connection and no import, it would be extremely cost a lot if we would have no curtailment, and this is the only scenario where we have a lot of curtailment, about 40%. But with this curtailment, also here the prices are quite low. They are below 9 cents per kilowatt hours. We have also very low sensitivity to the different years. We modeled them separately, but the results were almost the same. The results for this scenario here, about 8.5 or 8 to 8.5 cents per kilowatt hours. You see the current price levels. They are currently at 400 euro per megawatt hour, so 40 cents per kilowatt hours, which is 5 times as high as we modeled here. What would this mean about 15% of energy curtailment? Looking at the power curtailed, which this would induce, this is about 45% from the possible power coming from a module would have to be, so it would be 55% would have to be curtailed from the maximum which a module could produce. This was done based on modeled 1-minute data for Bern. It looks a little bit different if you look at Hamburg or to the United States, but the general rules are the same all over the world. Coming to the conclusions, so overall the results of our energy perspectives of the energy perspectives 2050 could be confirmed. E-fuel is quite expensive also in our model, but they can play a pivotal catalyst role. Finally, the annual costs are quite low, but they are important as a filler of some gaps in the wintertime. The model 10 to 85 gigawatt of batteries are feasible compared also to the electrical vehicle batteries, where about 200 of gigawatt hours of battery storage is foreseen in Switzerland alone. The standalone grid operation would increase the costs only by an average of 7% because of this overbuilding and curtailment. Finally, the curtailment lowers production costs by about 63% with import-export and 450% for a standalone. So overbuilding and curtailment is the enabler of the energy transition, and there should be no zero energy model without curtailment taken into account. Come to my last slide. So finally, renewables are securing the cost and climate. The quicker we can get to the 100% the stable system, and the less it is depends on imported energy. But there is no fast track. So to build the 40 gigawatts, it would take about 20 years when we can install about 1 gigawatt per year. So it can be done within one winter or 5 years. It's almost impossible to go over this 2 gigawatts because of the manpower we need to build this. But it was also stated already by Richard, so the current support and market system have to be remodeled to obtain this optimum for the economy, and how to adopt the political and the technical regulations to achieve this is an open question and has to be investigated. And the market system based on this marginal cost as it is today seems unlikely to fit for myself. So that's all from my side. Thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer your questions at the end of this set.
Thanks very much, Jan. That was a very interesting presentation on scenarios that can achieve a goal of eliminating existing and aging nuclear power plants, which are baseload systems, to still achieving your baseload requirements through variable renewable energy sources such as PV under this firm power concept. Just a reminder to all of our attendees out there. We have many attendees, but please post your questions for the presenters. We'll get to your Q&A after the end of the presentations, but we've already got a lot of questions coming in, but just encourage you all to submit your questions when you can. Okay, our next speaker is Dr. Mark Perez. It's a great honor here to have a father-son team giving a presentation, giving these presentations at an ISES webinar. Mark is a lead researcher at the company called Clean Power Research, located in California and also Washington State, but Mark is in California, or his branch is in California. At Clean Power Research, he manages science and research in the area of high penetration solar potential assessment using remote sensing data, solar forecasting, PV spec inference, and DER, distributed energy resource adoption, and other domains. Mark's got a PhD from Columbia University, and he has a Bachelor of Science in Optical Engineering and a BA in Physics from the University of Rochester. So Mark, welcome. I'll turn the floor over to you.
Thank you, Dave. Yeah, very happy to be here and happy for this opportunity to talk about firm PV power, overbuilding and curtailment and all of this. I'm going to turn back the wheel of time a little bit here to 2018 when we completed this Minnesota Solar Pathways project. This was a 3-year U.S. Department of Energy funded initiative to study how the state of Minnesota specifically and the surrounding region can achieve 100% renewables. And this was funded by Sunshot, which is now known as the Solar Energy Technology Office at the U.S. Department of Energy. So I'll be speaking at this MISO region. As mentioned previously, this is the Midwestern Independent System Operator. So this is one of the largest transmission system operators in the United States. And this is the region which contains the state of Minnesota, among other states. Graphically, this is what it looks like from a shape perspective. Over at the bottom edge here, this is Louisiana and the Gulf Coast, the coast of the Gulf of Mexico. And up here is the Canadian border. The the parallel and the Great Lakes region. This is Chicago, extruded here from the MISO shape, which has its own transmission system operating. And this is the state of Michigan. So 120 gigawatts peak, 670 terawatt hours per year. Currently, the renewables are roughly 21 gigawatts of wind and 330 megawatts of PV. So orders of magnitude more wind. This region of the Dakotas, this is North and South Dakota. This is known as the Saudi Arabia of wind in local parlance. So there's a huge wind resource here. From a geographical perspective, it can be divided into 3 macro regions, and these are from the MISO, North, Central, and South, and 10 load resource zones pictured here are load balancing authorities or load balancing areas. The resource is vastly different across the MISO region, as can be expected. In zone 3 pictured here, this is the wind resource. This is the monthly capacity factor. So it's 30-day moving average just to see the seasonality of the resource. You can see that it troughs in the summer and peaks in the winter. And solar is quite the opposite. So they're seasonally diametrically opposed. So, and this is a similar picture to what you'd see elsewhere in many other parts of the world. By contrast, zone 10 has a higher PV capacity factor than wind. So the wind resource is low. They're still seasonally opposed, but the capacity factors are far different. So how do we optimize this capacity expansion in dispatch? For MISO, we match supply to demand. We use what we've called at Clean Power Research, the Clean Power Transformation Model, which we've used also in Switzerland and other parts of the world where we've employed this model. On the generation side, we have wind, solar, and gas, or some other flexible resource like e-fuels, as mentioned in the Swiss study, or biogas. From the balancing side, we have electricity storage and implicit storage for this study. So implicit storage is the overbuilding and curtailment that we've spoken about. It's a different situation from Switzerland. MISO region does not have large hydroelectric resources at their disposition. These hydro storage lakes add a lot of seasonal flexibility in the Swiss case, and that's not the case here in Minnesota. In terms of cost scenarios, we did 4 different cost brackets, 2025 and 2050 cost brackets from the NREL ATB. So 2025 high, this would be closer to what we used in Switzerland. We have CapEx and OpEx, capital and operating costs for PV, wind, storage, and new build gas power. These 4 scenarios are run for these 14 different geographic zones, which pictured on the previous page, each region having its own distinct load shape and resource characteristics. All in all, we ran 25,000 year-long hourly dispatch simulations across these 56 distinct scenarios. So this is less than we ran for Switzerland, all comprising, but I think you'll find the results interesting nonetheless. So let's start the story when renewables are small enough and capacity never to exceed load in any given hour. This is 5% energy penetration. You could see the duck curve forming here if you were to put the yellow up here and subtract it from the load, which is the black. Yellow is PV, black is load. This is 2025 low degree of technological development, PV alone. So this is a little bit more PV than the state of Michigan currently has. They don't quite have 5%. I think they have less than 1% currently. When we try to push the envelope to 100% PV, for instance, you start to need to, as mentioned previously, include energy storage. So you charge in the middle of the day in the green, and you dispatch that with the energy storage at night when there's no sun shining in the pink. The storage operation in this context would look like this. This is the 0 line here. Anything above 0, we're storing energy, and here we're discharging. In this case, we need to keep track of this dispatch duty cycle, so to speak, because here we can keep track of the required charge capacity. So this is the size of the hose, the intake hose to the energy storage needs to be 41 gigawatts for this scenario, for the state of Michigan, for this load balancing area, and 17 gigawatts of discharge capacity. And this is important to keep track of because different storage technologies have different costs associated with charging and discharging. Take, for instance, hydrogen storage. The electrolyzer costs a very different price per unit of power to the fuel cell that you'd use on the discharge size. This is what the time series of the state of charge of storage looks like for this week. So you can see the storage discharging at night and charging during the day, discharging at night, charging during the day. For this diurnal piece, we need about 230 gigawatt hours of storage energy capacity, so about 6 hours to mitigate this diurnality. For 100% penetration, here's the zoomed out picture for the full year. You can see we have summer surpluses and winter shortfalls. And we need about 66 gigawatts of PV on an energy basis. This, without overbuilding, we need a tremendous amount of seasonal storage, so about 13.5 terawatt hours. And this is just to show, once again, that the seasonal trend on an energy basis is much, much larger than the diurnal trend. This is very expensive, as shown before. This is the unconstrained PV cost that was shown 2 presentations ago. Right here, you can see it's very small in yellow. We're dominated by storage cost if we do no overbuilding. It's this entire chunk right here. And here, in this particular scenario, using the 2025 cost from NREL, we are above $1 per kilowatt hour. This will never happen economically. We can optimize PV overbuilding in this case. With PV alone, we're at about 2.6x overbuild. And this is largely because we're only using PV and storage to meet load. We're not using other seasonal generation or other dispatchable generation like we showed in the Swiss results. Here, this is just PV storage meeting load. And we need a lot more overbuilding if that's the case, because there's nothing else to do the balancing. Storage size is significantly diminished when we overbuild optimally. Here we're at about 719 gigawatt hours. And correspondingly, we find the sweet spot at 26.9 cents per kilowatt hour. This green piece right here, the margin on PV capacity, this is the implicit storage piece right here. So all in all, 2025, low degree of technological development, MISO Zone 7, 100% PV and storage at 27 cents per kilowatt hour. Let's look at the impact of price. Let's look at the 2050 high technological development costs, so lower costs. Here we already out of the box with these lowered costs, which are dynamically reducing by 70%. So now our sweet spot is at 7.9 cents per kilowatt hour, so significantly less. It's still cheaper than no overbuild in 2050. This is just to show where we were optimally built in 2025. So 2050 high technological development, 7.9 cents per kilowatt hour with 100% PV and storage in this region. What about wind? Does the same hold true? So this is wind alone. This is wind and storage meeting load directly. Here we have the opposite seasonality. So we have a summer shortfall and winter surpluses. Overbuilding also eliminates long drawdowns. Here, once again, we need a lot more overbuilding because we're only relying on a variable renewable resource and storage to meet load instead of relying on all these other flexible things that we did in the Swiss context. The cost is around the same, interestingly enough, after overbuilding is optimized and we find the sweet spot. It's about 6.2 cents per kilowatt hour. So implicit storage in this case saves about 86% in LCOE, and it's comparable to the PV LCOE at its own sweet spot, around 7 cents per kilowatt hour. So 2050 high technological development, MISO Zone 7, 100% wind and storage at 6.2 cents per kilowatt hour. How does wind and PV hybridization change price? So this is wind and PV together when they've been optimized in terms of the relative build outs of each of them and overbuild. We save 52% relative to PV alone when blending the two optimally and 24% relative to wind alone. We're at 4.7 cents per kilowatt hour. And this is still a stacked area plot over here. I didn't mention that previously. The red portions of this optimum curve are related to the marginal contribution of energy storage to the total cost, to the total LCOE. The green piece is the implicit overbuilt variable renewable capacity piece. The blue is the contribution from wind, and the yellow is the contribution from solar. So 2050 high technological development, MISO Zone 7, 100% PV, wind and storage at 4.7 cents per kilowatt hour. So how does the region size and location impact the LCOE? Let's look at the MISO central region. So a larger region that encompasses MISO Zone 7. Well, it's marginally cheaper, as can be expected. There's the effect of geographic dispersion. We move from 4.7 cents per kilowatt hour to 4.6. So 2050, high technological development, MISO central region, 100% PV, wind, and storage at 4.6 cents per kilowatt hour. What about all of MISO? Let's expand the region even further and use transmission to spread the generation around the entire region. Well, that's even marginally cheaper. And we've also equally optimally blended the PV and wind in each of these regional contexts. In this case, when we optimize the relative build outs of PV and wind, we're at 80% PV and 20% wind. And that speaks to the tremendous solar resource in the southern part of this MISO region. So here we're at 4.2 cents. So high technological development, 2050, all of MISO, 100% wind, PV, and storage at 4.2 cents per kilowatt hour. With 667 terawatt hours of annual usage, this equates to $28 billion of annual expenditures at this LCOE. So what if each load resource zone optimized for themselves? What if we, similar to Switzerland, cut the cord to each of the LBAs and optimize the build out of the variable renewables and storage in each of these contexts? And the color here is indicative of where the relative PV wind ratio ended up in terms of the balance between 100% PV and 100% wind. We're at roughly the same cost. If each load resource zone islanded themselves, we'd be at a weighted average cost for the whole region of 4.65 cents per kilowatt hour. So this equates to $31 billion a year. So this is essentially the value of a large TSO transmitting power throughout a large macro region. It saves about $3 billion per year. And here's a more specific slide showing where the ratio ended up from the PV wind relative build out optimization in each of these cases. This is what it looks like on a regional basis. This is if each MISO region islanded themselves. You can see only the northern region over here in the Dakotas, the Saudi Arabia wind aforementioned, has more wind than PV. All the others are more yellow than they are blue, interestingly enough. So this is 4.53 cents per kilowatt hour, weighted average cost, $30 billion a year, so $2 billion a year roughly, MISO region-wide interconnection. So this is cutting the cord to the perimeter of each region instead of the perimeter of each load balancing area. So the larger the interconnection region, the lower the cost generally, and therein lies the value of a TSO. So what about adding 5% new build gas, as we did for the state of Minnesota? It brings the cost down, it brings the optimal curtailment percentage down to below 20%. So about 17% cheaper than 100% renewables across MISO. We're at 3.5 cents per kilowatt hour. So gas does the same job as implicit storage does. And this, as we showed in Switzerland, doesn't necessarily need to be fossil gas. This could be biogas or e-fuels. This is what the dispatch looks like with the gas. If out of curiosity, this is a little bit complicated to explain in detail here, but you can see storage charging and discharging, gas dispatching when the storage is empty, this black piece right here, the wind dispatching as normal, and the PV trying to serve as much load as possible. So key takeaways, implicit storage has value. So overbuilding and curtailment is highly cost effective in every case, including in this MISO case. Wind and PV hybridization has tremendous value, and in Switzerland, we're a bit constrained regarding how much wind we can put in, or how much wind the Swiss people are likely to accept, given the topography. Very different story in the MISO region, and it does matter because they're seasonally anti-correlated. Cost matters significantly, as shown time and again in these types of presentations. Technology costs are declining rapidly for all of the system components mentioned here, and that will correspondingly alter the LCOEs and the relative value compared to other alternative future energy sources. If you raise the wind cost relative to the PV cost, you decrease the optimal wind percentage. Raise the storage cost relative to the renewables, you increase the implicit storage usage, and so on. Confidence and consensus around these costs will help solidify the planning process. I think, or it stands to reason. PV is generally greater than wind, largely from a cost perspective, really. I mean, the costs are declining so rapidly for PV, and as the Lazard image shown, it's the cheapest energy source on the planet currently. And given economies of scale, this only stands to continue. Not to say that wind is not valuable. It's valuable where you have very high resource, and the seasonal anti-correlation makes it a big firming technology. So PV is favored in 2050, given the low cost. And this is despite a very strong wind resource in the northern part of MISO territory. Some of those northern regions, despite the high resource, still have more PV built out in 2050, given the projected costs. So the exceptions are MISO North and MISO Zone 3 and 7, where the strong wind resource supersedes and tilts the balance a little bit towards wind. So flexibility is very important. 5% flexibility decreases cost by 20% in this case. 95% renewables is significantly cheaper, even if we use fossil gas. But again, we could use some other renewable derived gas like e-fuels or biogas, which would have a net zero carbon impact. And again, transmission has value in this case. The larger the region we interconnect across, the lower the aggregate cost. So on the whole, this will save ratepayers billions annually, this transmission interconnection. The risk is, you could have an issue like Ukraine conflict and Russia, where, regional actors take matters into their own hands and stop power flow or use it as a political weapon. So that's the risk in this large scale interconnection. There is value in regional resiliency, which we've highlighted here. So 100% MISO load, 30% wind, 65% solar, and 5% gas at 3.5 cents per kilowatt hour. That's not too bad. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Mark. It was a very interesting and important analysis of the cost sensitivities to the concepts that we've been talking about here during this webinar. So appreciate that, and I encourage all of you to continue to submit your questions. We'll have a little bit of time for Q&A at the end of these presentations. Our final presentation for today is going to be presented by Professor Patricia Hidalgo Gonzalez. She is the director of the Renewable Energy and Advanced Mathematics Laboratory at the UC San Diego, University of California, San Diego. This lab focuses on high penetration of renewable energy using optimization, control theory, and machine learning. She's developed a stochastic power system expansion model to study the Western North America's grid under climate change uncertainty, and is currently working with the California Energy Commission to understand the value and role of long duration energy storage. And she's also doing additional work with the U.S. Department of Energy on wave energy and offshore wind, also for the U.S. power grid. So Patricia, welcome, and I'll turn the floor over to you.
Okay, thanks Dave for the introduction. And I believe you're seeing my screen now. All right, and thank you for having me today. I was very excited to see how some of our results align, and also how we have differences across the regions. So let's get into some of the details. So today I'll be talking about part of the work that I've been carrying out with some collaborators for the California Energy Commission, looking at long duration storage and the role that it could have in Western North America. So I'm going to go over the methodology that we use, which is the switch-WEC model, a capacity expansion model. And then I'm going to highlight some of the key results from one of our studies. And I'm happy to go into more details in other parts of the studies that I won't cover during the presentation as well. Okay, so with this, let's talk about the model. So we have a base understanding on what's the tools that we use and what are the questions that we can answer. So the switch-WEC model, it's an open source model. Everyone's welcome to download it or clone it from our GitHub repo. And the switch model has been developed for several regions across the world. And for this study, it's focusing in the WEC, so the western side of North America. And as a capacity expansion model, it's deterministic and a linear program. It could also be set up as a stochastic program and also as a mixed integer program to do unit commitment. But for this study, it's used deterministic and linearly. And what it does, as capacity expansion models do, it minimizes the total cost of the power system in terms of generation investment and operation, and also transmission investment and operation. And geographically, we are covering the Western US, or the Western Electricity Coordinating Council, and we split it in 50 load areas that are representing where there's transmission congestion. So we capture that those corridors, and then we can model how, looking into the future, we would need to expand our existing capacity for the lines as well. And in terms of time, the model is very flexible. Some examples are when we optimize for like every decade, so let's say 2030, 40, and 50, or we could also focus on one specific decade of interest, as I'll be showing for this study, where we're focusing in 2050. And in terms of the time resolution, it's also very flexible. It's up to the user. So one could sample, for example, every hour of the days that you chose to represent the entire year or the entire decade. Or you could sample, as I wrote in this example, every 4 hours for every day that you're sampling, and you could choose a subset of days to represent the entire year, or you could choose every single day of the full year, depending on the question that you're trying to answer. And one characteristic of this model that it's important to highlight is that it doesn't optimize capacity in one phase and then optimize dispatch as a second phase, like in a disconnected way, but it makes optimal decisions simultaneously for dispatch and investment decisions. And the benefit behind this is that it gives us what will be the optimal, or the technical optimal, for capacity expansion and dispatch simultaneously. Meaning what could be the best we could ever do if we were to optimize this way. In reality, we cannot do that, of course, because it's hard, one, to predict what are going to be the costs and all the inputs that we use in these models. But also, the idea of having this type of analysis is that it could tell us what's the best that we could do. And then from there, we see where we lay in the end, in reality. All right. So just to give you a sense on what are the type of inputs that we're using for the WACC and the outputs that we can get for this model. So in terms of inputs, we use all the existing generators in the WACC. So roughly a little bit over 3,000 from the latest EIA form. And we also model potential new generators that you could decide to build out across the WACC. So for that, we have roughly 7,000 potential new generators. And here you can see a snapshot. These are the locations for wind where we can choose from to build more wind projects or wind farms. And this is a snapshot of what are the locations that we could build for solar power. And these two come from NREL, and we filter based on the highest capacity factors and also lowest connection cost and proximity to substations, as well as terrain, making sure that the build out it's actually reasonable and you don't have to build a line through a mountain, for example. So that's how we narrow down from having the highest resolution raw data from NREL into something more realistically that we could deploy. And in terms of the lines, the transmission lines, we aggregate the existing lines across the WACC according to these 50 load zones that I mentioned that we model. And in terms of the electricity demands, we have the data hourly for each of the 50 load zones that we have. And we also have hourly capacity factors for existing wind and solar, and also for candidate wind and solar that the model might choose to build out. And as part of the inputs, we have fuel cost assumptions and overnight cost assumptions as well. And as for outputs, we have what's the optimal investment for new generators and new transmission lines for the different decades that we might be modeling. And also we get the optimal hourly dispatch if we were modeling with an hourly resolution, or whichever is the time resolution that we're choosing for the decades that we're modeling. And as well, we can track what are the CO2 emissions by generator with the time resolution that we might be running, and also what are going to be the investment and operational cost of each of the scenarios that we run. So now that we have a basic understanding of what's the model that we're using and what are the inputs and the outputs, I want to get into some of the preliminary results that we've been having for the California Energy Commission. So this work, it's collaborative work with many colleagues, and it's titled The Value of Long Duration Storage and its Interaction with a Zero Emissions Electricity Grid, which is under review. And the motivation for this work is the fact that the US future requirement for energy in storage or its duration for this growing demand in a reliable zero emissions grid, it's still unclear. So we still need to understand what's going to be that requirement. And there are several studies looking at this question. Some are reporting that 100% renewable energy grids are possible without storage or with storage. And then other studies are relying on clean firm power, and others take it even further out and they look at achieving negative emissions by using biomass. And other studies are looking at intraday storage, and in some cases they take into the case of what could happen if we do have seasonal storage available and at what price point that would need to happen. So in this study, we have a set of contributions, and I'm going to focus on some of them today. So we quantify the benefits in electricity pricing if we were to have federal or state mandates for long duration energy storage, meaning if we have a type of regulation at the federal or at a state level, how much energy capacity would be that mandate for, and what would be the impact that it would have on electricity pricing. So that can give us an understanding on what could be a good idea for a mandate if we were to have one. And then we test a set of factors on how the deployment of long duration storage would change, depending on what's the ratio of solar to wind deployed in the WEC, and also what happens if we have transmission expansion restricted, as it's so politically complicated in the US. We want to understand the balance of this. So what will happen if we don't have new transmission built, for example. And we also look at the sensitivity of running a set of different cost projections for long duration storage for 2050, and we see how it gets deployed depending on those assumptions. And last but not the least important, what happens when we model hydropower availability worldwide? And I'm going to focus on these two, looking at what happens with the deployment of long duration storage, depending on the ratio that we have, solar to wind, and also what happens depending on the cost assumption. And in terms of how we set up our capacity expansion model, so we sample 6 hours per day. We sample every day for the year 2050. So we run a 365 model, sampling 6 hours per day. And we're modeling no emissions, so 0 CO2 emissions by 2050 WEC-wide. So let's get into some of the results, as I was mentioning earlier. So in this first set, we're looking at what happens when the ratio of wind to solar changes, or when we have a solar dominant grid or a wind dominant grid. So in these two figures, we're looking at two different scenarios that we run. And in both, we're forcing artificially what's going to be the ratio of wind to solar. When we don't force anything in the model, we get roughly 80% solar to 20% wind, very similar to the case of MISO, as I just learned, which is very interesting. So on the left, we have a solar dominant grid where we're forcing more solar than what we get in our baseline. And then on the right, we have a wind dominant grid for the WEC. And what you see in colors, it's the capacity build out for the different technologies. So in yellow, you see solar. And then the other part that I want to highlight is in light blue, you see wind deployment. And the other part that I want you to know before we talk about the results is that the dot inside of these pie charts is showing the duration of the storage facilities that gets built in these different 50 load zones. So duration is defined in this study as the energy capacity that we built over the power capacity for the storage facilities. So for example, if you have a 10 gigawatt hour energy capacity and then a 2 gigawatt of power capacity, that would give you a 5-hour duration facility. So the interesting thing when we're having a solar dominant grid is that in all these load zones where solar power is dominating, you see that this circle that I was just mentioning is light pink, representing 6 to 10 hours of duration for storage, which makes sense because it's supporting this diurnal cycle that we see in solar power. And then when we move to the other scenario where we have a more wind dominant case, we see now in the load zones where they deploy mostly wind, we see this darker pink, and that's representing 10 to 20 hours of duration for the storage facilities that are getting deployed. So now let's change gears a little bit and let's look at the other set of scenarios where we're changing the cost assumption for the energy capacity for storage, long duration storage. So in this set of scenarios, let me walk you through this table so you can parse it a little more efficiently. So in this column, we have the different cost assumptions for energy capacity that we're using. And our baseline was NREL ATB, the conservative projections for 2050. And then we do a sensitivity around it to see if R&D were to get to these different cost targets, what could be the optimal deployment WEC-wide. So the first result that I want to show you is that when we go from the most expensive assumption to the cheapest assumption for energy capacity, we see that the energy capacity build out WEC-wide ranges from 1.5 terawatt hours all the way to 36 terawatt hours, which is a substantial change. And then another interesting result is that if we look at the largest storage duration, so basically the highest duration across the WEC, when we have the most expensive cost assumption, we see roughly 9 hours of duration being the maximum. And then when we go to the cheapest cost assumption, we see all the way to 825 hours of duration, which is 34 days. So now we're talking about seasonal storage, going across, like storing electricity for over 30 days and dispatching as needed. And another interesting result from this experiment is what happens with new transmission build out WEC-wide. And similarly, we see that in the lowest cost assumption, compared from our baseline, new transmission expansion needs to decrease by 75%, which is substantial. So meaning that we could focus in only those critical corridors to make sure that we are minimizing our cost if we were able to reach this type of R&D scenario. All right, so now let's look, changing gears again, look at the other set of scenarios that I wanted to highlight today, looking at what could happen if we have some storage mandates WEC-wide. And what should be that mandate, or maybe not what should be that mandate, but what that mandate would affect in terms of electricity pricing, and that could inform if we would like to have a mandate like that, what should be the choice around that value. So in this plot, we're looking at the cost of electricity, or the price of electricity, I should say, so meaning the locational marginal price. And then on the x-axis, we're looking at different scenarios where we're forcing a different mandate for energy capacity for storage to be built. So every point that you see, it's a result from a different run of our model, forcing, for example, here, 20 terawatt hours being built out of energy capacity WEC-wide. So then from this figure, the takeaway is that as we increase the storage mandate, so as we increase that amount through the different runs of the model that we have, we see that there's this critical point of the 20 terawatt hours of energy capacity mandated that decreases the variability in our electricity prices the most dramatically. Beyond that, we continue to see this spread getting shrunk, however, at a much slower rate. So meaning that this 20 terawatt hours of WEC-wide energy capacity mandate is showing that it could be a critical point on what could be an interesting drop, or have an interesting drop in electricity pricing for 2050. Now, similarly in this figure, we're looking also at electricity price on the y-axis, and then we're looking at this different storage mandates that we could be enforcing. And now we're looking at a breakdown for different regions across the WEC, and we basically have a curve for every of the 50 load cells, but to make it visually more appealing, we aggregate for different states and different regions. So we see that there is variability in electricity pricing across the states, as we see that nowadays as well. So that would also prevail, that difference across the regions. And now in this other figure, similarly to the other two, we're plotting electricity pricing on the y-axis, and then the different scenarios that we run for storage mandates. And now in this case, we see that an interesting result is what we would expect, is that the cheapest hours, or the hours of the day that would have the lowest electricity pricing, would be from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m. And that's because of the solar power generation that we would have. You would drop the prices quite dramatically during those hours of the day. And then relatively looking at this drop in electricity prices, we see the similar trend that we were looking at before. The 20 terawatt hours of energy capacity mandate would reduce relatively the LMPs the most compared to the other type of mandates where the decrease it's a little more progressive. And last but not least, I wanted to show the electricity pricing breakdown for the different months of the year. And then seeing how this breakdown for the different months or seasons of the year changes as we increase this energy capacity mandate that I've been discussing. So we could see that the blue line and then this orange line are the ones that show the highest prices, and that makes sense because December and July are the months of the year that have the highest load for the WEC. So understandably so, the electricity prices are going to peak then as well. And we see a similar result as we've been discussing when we go to the 20 terawatt hour of storage mandate. We see this spread reduce quite dramatically, and then as we increase the mandate, it continues to reduce, but at a much slower rate, meaning that this 20 terawatt hours, it's a critical point that we should be looking at. And now to conclude, we talked about how depending on the grid composition, if it's solar or wind dominant, it might be more, it might be cost effective to have durations of storage between 6 to 10 hours to support solar dominant grids, or 10 to 20 hours to support wind dominant grids. And we also looked at how R&D can play an important role in optimal deployment of long duration storage. And we see that when we achieve, if we were to achieve an energy capacity capital cost of $5 per kilowatt hour, it could enable a mean duration of 28 hours and a maximum duration of 400 hours. And as we just discussed, if we were to have storage mandates WEC-wide, it could mitigate electricity prices variability and seasonality in a zero emissions grid. So with that, I'll be happy to take any questions, and I believe all of us will take questions now as well, so thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Patricia. That was a very interesting analysis that you've been doing, or work that you're doing, and ongoing work, especially regarding to long duration storage. And so this is really a key component of the concept of firm PV power. So now I have the challenge of taking all the questions that have come in and trying to give everybody an opportunity to get their questions answered. What I would like to do is just create a panel discussion here by having everybody share their, all the speakers share their camera, or turn on their camera. And just quickly, a number of people have asked a question about whether the slides are available and or will be made available. And yes, they will be available on the ISES homepage. And of course, this webinar will also be made available. The recording of the webinar will be made available to the ISES membership. Arabella can give you a little bit more detail about that after we're done with this Q&A session here. But we have about maybe 5 minutes to sort of try to cover the questions. One very general question is associated with curtailment and how can we avoid curtailment? And actually, what is the definition of curtailment? Maybe we should start with that. There's curtailment typically is an undesirable outcome for developers because when their projects are curtailed and the utility is not using the power, they are not getting any income during that time. So we clearly want to identify ways to, rather than curtail these technologies, or at least curtail them under the current contracting schemes, and find alternative uses for them. So I'm not sure who I should address this question to. I'll just open up to all of you. If you could, first of all, maybe define specifically what we mean by curtailment, and secondly, what are some productive uses that we can make of curtailment? A number of people are asking questions such as related to EV storage, of course, power to gas or power to X concept, power to hydrogen, aluminum's, high demand times for aluminum production, for example. All of these technologies could make use of curtailed energy. So
all right, I'll take 1 minute and then I'll let the other fill in.
Thank you, Richard.
Yeah, curtailment is wasting. It's just throwing the energy away. However, it's the enabler of low cost. If you don't do it, you're going to pay more. The problem is today you avoid curtailment because the system is such that you have to monetize everything you produce. So curtailment is taboo, but curtailment is a solution. So the key is to change the way systems operate. Instead of valuing production like we do today with PPAs and others, you have to value firm power. And the minute you do that, you will curtail because that's going to be the key to the lowest solution. You just throw away some of the solar and it gets you there just because you pay so much less for storage. So if you change the paradigm, curtailment is the way to go. If you don't, you will want to avoid curtailment, but you'll get stuck with a marginal PV world as we have today with crises, fighting with utilities and the like. That's my 2 cents. So I'll let the others add money to that.
Yeah,
So,
I fully agree. Yes.
yeah.
That's the case. Curtailment was a bad thing historically when PV was expensive. So we are still stuck to this image. So, but in future, it's really the enabler. You need to curtail it, and you really have to change the market system, how the financing of such systems are done currently. That's the main point. Otherwise, there is a conflict between the optimum of the investment and the optimum of the whole economy or of a country, and we have to find somehow with the policy to get this optimal point for a whole economy and not just for the single investor. But of course, they have the investments have to be done, so they need to have some extra money or other solutions to get these PV installations built. That's very important.
Okay, I have one more point to make on this. Yeah, I think this is an interesting question that I think gets asked quite a bit because curtailment brings to mind waste. You know, we're wasting energy. It feels like a waste, and that doesn't really fit in with the whole renewable, moving to renewables and, you know, saving the planet ethos, generally speaking. But one thing to consider is that without curtailment, we'd otherwise be wasting an enormous amount of energy storage, whether that's pumped hydro and, you know, putting up dams in high altitude areas and filling up those reservoirs with water, flooding valleys, or building a ton of battery storage with electrochemical technology. We're talking about overbuilding 50% and reducing the amount of storage energy capacity tenfold. You know, and in that context, we're saving 10x on the materials associated with lithium-ion batteries, which do have their environmental issues associated with them. And we're only adding maybe 20 to 50% on margin of silicon, you know, sand, basically, which is the second most abundant element near its crust after oxygen. So from a material availability perspective and environmental perspective, I think curtailment is actually less wasteful. So I think a reframing of that is important. And the other point is that, you know, we're already curtailing or wasting all of the solar energy or the majority that's hitting the Earth's continents. You know, it's just being absorbed or reflected. So, you know, we're already curtailing all the solar energy that's hitting. It's being used for other purposes to grow plants. You know, in urban areas, it's just being absorbed into the asphalt and the building rooftops. We should at the very least be collecting and harvesting that energy, and that would reduce the curtailment by building more PV.
I would like to add one more cent to the bucket. So when we're looking at curtailment, as everyone has said, it's a cost-effective solution that we get from operating the grid, and it's important to look at when throughout the day that's happening. So, for example, when we're looking at electricity prices, as we get into the evening, that's when we see prices go up because we started seeing our net load increase. Everyone's getting home, so you start cooking, using more electronics and so forth. So the marginal price of electricity starts rising. So if you have a grid where you're wanting to rely on more solar power, as you're moving into the evening, solar power is going to be decreasing because your radiance decreases. So if you're looking at making sure that you have enough solar power, let's say at 4 p.m., when electricity prices are going up, then you want to size your PV arrays or your PV farms to meet that demand at 4 p.m., for example. But then if you're looking at, if you size for 4 p.m. to then reduce your electricity cost, because PV is so cheap, as we have been discussing, that means that at noon, when you have the highest irradiance, you're going to be overproducing PV compared to the demand that you were planning for at 4 p.m. So then that's why we end up curtailing when we have the highest irradiance at noon. But again, that's not a bad problem, because having that excess electricity, it's definitely cost effective given the cost savings that we're having from having solar power around 4 p.m., for instance. And as a consumer, if you want to help with penetration of renewables, start consuming more electricity when we're curtailing. So that would be around noon. That's when we have a lot of curtailment in California, for instance. So if you want to start charging your EVs, you could do it at noon. That would be the best. Or depending on the utility where you are, there are programs where you can choose to pay a different tariff depending on your time of use of your electricity. So if you choose to participate in those programs, you'll be benefiting from using more electricity before 4 p.m. So for example, in San Diego, if you're consuming outside of 4 p.m. to 9 p.m., then you pay or not cheap, but like a lower tariff. So those are metrics or programs that are in place to help us in reduce curtailment.
Okay, thank you all for your responses to that. I noticed that we are now at the end of the time set up for this webinar. So Arabella, let me ask you if we could take a few more minutes. There are many questions here. I'm not sure if we're going to get anywhere near through all of them, and perhaps it might be useful for attendees to reach out to the individual presenters after the webinar. But Arabella, maybe you can let us know what we have time for here.
Yeah, no worries. I'd say we are good for another 10, 12-ish minutes, if that's all right.
Okay, let me try to go through and give each speaker an opportunity to answer a question addressed to them. I'll start with Richard. Solar exceeds the load in New York according to your slide. How much solar PV capacity in terms of megawatts, can be installed without exceeding the load? In other words, how much area in New York is available for solar, which would result in how much PV when fully utilized? And the cooling load during the summer is also increasing to climate change. So there's a lot there to that question. You have any particular response to it right now?
Short response, yes. Solar will exceed the load by vast amounts. If you want to do 100% all the time, you're going to have your solar resource will be 10 times the load. The thing is that you will manage it in a way that will supply solar power all the time, in winter, in summer, and at night. You will optimize the curtailment of that solar output. You will optimize the battery, and you will get that at 5 to 6 cents per kilowatt hour in New York. So don't think of solar being trapped underneath the load and not being able to exceed. If you want to meet a 10 megawatt load, you have to build 100 megawatts of solar at peak. So you have enough solar to feed all the rest. The thing is, you have to optimize the batteries, the overbuild, the curtailment, and your bottom line is very good. But it's a little bit different paradigm to think that way. So we have to move away from the marginal thinking. Don't think intraday, don't think charging at night, at the day. The real problem is annual, the big holes in winter. How do you fill power 365 days a year? If you solve that, you solve everything else. And the bottom line is very good.
Very good. Does anybody else want to add to that before I go to the next question? Okay, Jan, here is one that was addressed to you. To what extent are the storage values shown in this analysis resilient against climate extremes? For example, climate change resulting in long drought periods, so that hydropower in Switzerland becomes less reliable.
As I stated, we didn't take climate change into account. There are some risks, as we have it this summer at the moment, that the lakes will not be as full as it should be. This is also the case in many other regions in Europe and also the United States. Climate change will also help to some extent. because the winter will be shorter. 1 month it is already shorter, and the hydro dams, the seasonal storage has been built for the winter time. And so the spring comes earlier, and that's why it makes it also easier to have this seasonal storage. It lowers the needs for this. So there are two sides, and I would say, of course, the variability is growing quite a lot, but with a little bit more of storage, and it helps more climate change than it is a danger to this system, I would say. It also helps, it makes more the load for the summertime for the cooling systems, which will come also in Switzerland, and it lowers the energy needs for the heating in the winter time.
Okay, one other question I'll address to you, Jan. Somebody asked if you could share your cost curves for e-fuels, and that you mentioned electric vehicle storage size comparison. Have you also considered fuel cells, aluminum fuel cells, for example, that are now being built in India as part of that e-fuel component?
No, we have the price of the e-fuels, which is quite high. So the electricity made with e-fuels would be about 20 cents per kilowatt hours. Actually, that's about the price, or with gas at the moment in Europe, it's about 40 cents per kilowatt hours due to this war in the Ukraine. And even with the high price we included, it doesn't make a lot of change because we use it only 0 to 5-6% for the annual mean. So it doesn't make a lot of change, but we didn't go into the technical details. We just make a huge high level assumptions of the cost levels and didn't go into too much of the details because a lot of modeling has been done within this Energy Perspectives 2050, which was really the basis of our calculations.
Okay, thank you. Mark, you got a lot of very positive comments and favorable comments on your analysis, so thank you for your presentation. I have a two-part question here. One is, what type of energy storage did you use in your case study? And the other kind of more general comment or question is, have you been able to share your results with the political leadership? And if so, with any political leadership at any level, state, federal level, whatever, what have you? And if so, what has been their response?
Those are both great questions. The technology we used from a modeling perspective in the MISO and Minnesota case studies was lithium ion storage, and we used the cost from the ATB as many others did here in their presentations. Not to say that it couldn't be any other storage technology, that's just what was accepted by the technical review committee of this process. It's a very modular technology, it can be built anywhere, and it's given the economies of scale and the vastly growing lithium ion market, the costs are declining more rapidly than other storage modalities and archetypes. But I'm very storage agnostic, so this type of modeling could work with any storage cost. It's just you would get more or less overbuilding depending on how much that energy storage costs on an energy basis. And what was the second question, Dave? It was, have I spoken to any political?
Yeah, the political.
Right, yeah.
Have there been any political outreach with these studies?
Well, this was, this project specifically was, it was led by the Minnesota Department of Commerce, which is the rate making agency in the state of Minnesota. So they set the electric utility rates for the ratepayers in the state. So they're a political agency. So they were all involved in this process heavily. They were the prime on the DOE contract. And it was very favorable. There's discussion all across the political spectrum in Minnesota and in MISO now about this. At least it's been incepted into their minds, this idea that maybe things need to be restructured from an energy market standpoint. Nothing has really happened. There's no firm PV tariffs or anything like that, but it's definitely percolating. So I can't see any demonstrable regulatory change as a result of this work, but it's definitely an idea that has circulated widely in the region.
Okay, thank you. Yes, as we know, it's challenging, especially at the federal level, to get much change to occur anyway. And we were very fortunate that we had some change that's enacted, hopefully signed off by the president here shortly in this country. But still, it's a challenge to get change. Thought of a transformation of an energy system into the political realm here is very challenging. And Patricia, I had several questions for you, but let me just pull up one here because I think we're about going to run out of time. And that is, what does it mean to have more than 24 hours of energy storage capacity?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when we go beyond 10 hours, that's when we're looking at supporting sources that don't have this daily cycle. So when we have 6 to 10, we were looking at storage to support like PV deployment, because it has daily cycle. So you charge, through 10 hours, and then you start discharging in the next 10 hours, for instance. But when we're looking at beyond 20, what that means is that now we're looking at intra-week storage, or when we go beyond even larger, like across month storage. So that's addressing the seasonality aspect. So let's say that we have some days that are more cloudy, for instance, or some days when we have like lower winds. That means that if we have storage that can save our electricity for more than a day or more than 3 days, we can charge our batteries when we have low resource, if we have cloudy days, low wind days, and then we can discharge, I think the other way around, we can charge them when we have rich days, and then we discharge when we have those cloudy days or low wind speed days. So that's what it means when we have more than 20 hours or more than 100 hours, more across the day storage arbitrage or across the seasons. But yeah, I'll be happy to follow up with anyone offline.
Great, thank you, Patricia. So I think that's probably all the time we have, unless we have time for each panelist to give one last quick comment. By the way, the very last question that came in is a question, it's a very general question for all of us. Is solar PV truly sustainable in the long run? I think we all have our strong opinions about the answer to that, but if I have time, Arabella, can we just give each panelist a quick minute to summarize their key points?
Yes, please go ahead.
Yeah, so Patricia, let's start with you. If you have any quick takeaways you'd like the attendees to this webinar here.
Yeah, absolutely. So having 100% renewable grids is possible, as you've seen from most of our studies, and it's not necessarily more like costly. And what we do need to be, it's like smart about our decisions in terms of how we're deploying the support for that type of grid. So make sure that you're getting informed, that you can make the right choices at your level. For example, if you're in a utility, choose the programs that will enable to have more renewables in the grid. And we could do that as consumers. But yeah, that would be my 10 seconds.
Very good, thank you. Mark, how about you?
Yeah, I think given the size of the resource, I think solar is the way to go. I think it's the intrinsic underlying resource which fuels most of the other resources, both fossil and renewable on this planet. You know, there are a couple exceptions, nuclear and geothermal, but it's the biggest resource available. From a material utilization standpoint, it's pretty low impact because we're talking about the second most abundant element in the Earth's crust as the main material doing the power generation. So I think from those two standpoints, it's probably the way that we should be focusing our efforts. From a deployment standpoint, obviously, you know, building big PV farms in sensitive areas and affecting wildlife and whatnot is not the best, you know, land use, I think, but novel concepts like agrivoltaic, where you combine PV and cropland, and when you build it on rooftops and roadways, this is all using existing, already occupied human land use, you know, in a minimally impactful way. So I think if you want to have an impact, convince your, you know, regulators to adopt firm PV tariffs if that's possible, and to better regulate where the PV is being installed and the way it's being installed, because right now it's just building PV farms in the cheapest land area, which isn't necessarily the most forward-thinking land use, I think.
Thank you. Very good points. Jan, how about you?
Yes, I think this concept of curtailment and overbuilding is really the enabler of the energy transition, together with a lot of PV. Without this concept, it would be quite expensive, and that is also what is shown to us. But together with this concept, it's really cheap, so it can secure the climate, it can secure the costs, and enhances also the energy security. So it's really a game changer. And what we have to change is also this system, how that installations are financed, and also the market regulations. That's the next important big step we have to do.
Thank you. And Richard, you get the last word here.
Thank you. Well, I'd say, yeah, solar is big time out there, with a little help of wind in some places and hydro in others. But the thing that has to be done is change the paradigm, move away from the margin, stop thinking charging at night, using during the day, limiting, embrace curtailment as the big enabler instead of trying to avoid it, as everything is built around avoiding curtailment today, and it has to change. Otherwise, we'll get stuck.
All right, thank you. And I'll just close by saying I want to thank all the panelists for their outstanding presentations. I think they really demonstrated that certainly from a technological perspective, a transformation to a 100% renewable energy system driven largely by variable renewable energy sources, primarily PV and wind with storage, is certainly feasible. The challenges, and I think webinars like this help overcome some of the challenges of making sure there's a general public knowledge about what this transformation means and how it affects the final end user, since we'll have a much more dramatically expanded electricity system as our final end use energy. And also to get politicians on board to understand what this means and the good outcomes that result from a 100% renewable energy system. So with that said, I would like to turn it back over to Arabella. Again, thank you, panelists, and thanks to all the attendees for your participation. And Arabella, you can wrap up here now for us.
Yes, thank you, Dave. Thank you, everybody, for your great presentations, and to the audience for sharing all of your questions with us. I'm just going to close out here with a few organizational comments. As we mentioned before, this webinar has been recorded and the presentations have been sent in to us, and we're going to make all of that available on the ISES homepage in a few days. It's going to stay available there for just a short while, and then it's going to move into the ISES webinar archive. And here, ISES members have unlimited long-term access to all of the presentations and recordings. And I think we go back all the way to 2012 now, so there's loads for you to catch up on and see where we've been almost 10, 12 years ago and where we are now. So this is all going to be available to you. And then my final comment for today is we have an event coming up, as I mentioned in the beginning. We have Eurosun 2022 coming up in September here in Germany, in Kassel. And this is the ISES and IEA HAC International Conference on Solar Energy for Buildings and Industry. Registration is open. I know quite a lot of our speakers today are actually, I think, joining us in Kassel, so that's something to look forward to as well. And there's more information for all of you on our homepage. That's eurosun2020.org. If you want to register, we have a wide range of discounts available for attendees, for example, from outside Europe. So definitely worth having a look into that. Yeah, and with that, I thank everybody for joining us, and have a good day wherever you are. And we're going to see you next on the next ISES webinar. Bye, everybody.
Bye. Thank you.